What you are about to hear is a story about a number, not the number of threats in a 40-page security report, not the number of headlines generated by a motorcade dispute, a much simpler number, 43. 43 paying spectators at a wheelchair basketball match during the 2025 Invictus Games. And the question that number raises about everything else in this story. Hello friends, my name is James, and you are watching Royal Daily Report, your #1 source for the most exclusive and most shocking royal stories on the internet. If you are new here, hit that subscribe button right now, because tonight we are going deeper than the headlines on the security dispute, the privately commissioned report, and what the gap between a 40-page document and a liaison officer phone number actually tells you about where this entire story stands right now. And if you have been with us from the beginning, you already know we never hold back. We never pull back. Let us get into it. And before we go one single word further, if you are not subscribed to Royal Daily Report, you are missing the most complete royal analysis anywhere on the internet right now. Hit that subscribe button, turn on those notifications, because this story has layers that most channels have not fully examined. Subscribe now. Let us get into it. Picture the scene before we dive into any of the specific details, because the human context matters more than the individual headlines that have been circulating. A wounded veteran, someone who lost a limb, their sight, or their hearing in active service to their country, signs up to compete in the Invictus Games, specifically because one man told them personally and repeatedly across many years that this particular cause was his own life's work, that it genuinely meant more to him than almost anything else he had ever publicly committed himself to. And then, in the run-up to the 1 year to go milestone for Birmingham 2027, that same veteran spends 2 straight weeks watching headline after headline about security reports, motorcades, and whether Meghan is coming to the UK, and starts to wonder whether the man who made that promise is still the same man who made it. That is the actual emotional core sitting underneath everything that has been circulating this month, underneath all the specific claims and counterclaims and dueling interpretations that tend to dominate the headlines. And it deserves to be named clearly and honestly before we work carefully through the actual details one by one. Subscribe to Royal Daily Report right now, because the document that kicked most of this off, and the critical detail that most initial coverage did not make sufficiently clear, is coming right now. Hit that button, turn on those notifications. Subscribe now. Last month, according to multiple reports, a confidential security assessment document was delivered to RAVEC, the UK government committee, specifically responsible for evaluating and making decisions about protection requests of exactly this kind for figures who no longer automatically qualify for state-funded security. The document, said to run around 40 pages, was reportedly prepared by a private security firm based in Los Angeles. Here is where the critical detail sits, the one that a lot of the initial coverage did not make sufficiently clear. This report was reportedly commissioned and paid for by Harry himself. He hired a private security company at reportedly significant cost to produce an assessment of the risks he personally faces. According to reports, the document described several alleged threats in considerable detail, including claims of specific plots, reportedly originating within Britain itself. References to an actual Al-Qaeda document that had apparently surfaced somewhere within the broader intelligence landscape, and hundreds of separate potential stalking concerns compiled from various sources over an extended period of time, painting a picture of persistent and wide-ranging risk. ITV News was the outlet that first broke coverage of the report, and from there, multiple other major outlets picked up and repeated its central findings. But critics have argued that a lot of that coverage focused heavily on the reported threats, without always making equally clear that the assessment came from a privately commissioned document rather than an independent government investigation. The way a lot of people absorbed the coverage was simple. This is real. This is serious. This is why he needs protection. What critics say did not receive nearly the same level of attention is a fairly basic and honestly quite obvious principle once you actually think about it. When a private security firm is directly paid by the very subject of its own assessment to go and evaluate that same subject's personal risk level, its resulting conclusions should probably be weighed carefully alongside other genuinely independent evaluations, rather than being treated uncritically as the final and definitive word on the actual threat level. According to the account being presented by critics, the government's actual response was notably limited. Revake reportedly did not hold a new reassessment meeting in response to the report. There was no public debate, no formal review process triggered at that stage, and Harry was given the contact information for a liaison officer, rather than being offered automatic police protection, a motorcade, or any elevated official status. For critics, that specific detail, a phone number, rather than an actual protective operation, says a genuinely significant amount about how officials must have actually assessed the underlying situation internally, away from public statements. Their argument is that if the government had genuinely concluded there was an elevated risk level requiring additional measures, established procedure would likely have produced a different response. Subscribe to Royal Daily Report right now, because the question that a lot of ordinary commenters raised on social media, in the aftermath of all this, is the one that most professional commentary somehow missed. And it genuinely reframes the whole debate. Subscribe, hit that button, turn on those notifications, subscribe now. Here is the question. If someone truly believed there were multiple active threats against their family, genuinely feared serious danger, and thought their own children faced real risk in a specific country, would they choose to bring those children there anyway? A lot of critics argue the honest answer is no, that most parents who sincerely believed the danger was at that level would avoid exposing their children to it entirely, regardless of what protective measures were or were not in place. But that is exactly what Harry publicly indicated he planned to do. The visit was announced ahead of time, with reports discussing possible dates, locations, the Invictus Games themselves, and even the possibility of visiting family or Diana's grave. Critics argue that if the actual level of danger matched the most serious version of the public claims, publicly sharing detailed travel plans involving his own family would be difficult to reconcile with that level of concern. Here is what a lot of critics believe fits the publicly available facts considerably better than a pure safety narrative. What if the central issue was never really about personal safety and isolation at any point in this entire multi-year dispute? What if the security debate has always been at least partly connected to a much broader and considerably more unresolved disagreement over official status recognition and what someone is entitled to after formally leaving an institution? Harry has personally traveled in recent years to Ukraine during active conflict, to Colombia, to Nigeria, countries that all carry genuinely documented and well-established security challenges. In some cases, considerably more acute and more immediate than anything currently facing London on any given day. Critics argue that this particular contrast is genuinely difficult to fully reconcile if the underlying and stated concern is purely and exclusively about physical personal safety. Others note fairly and reasonably that every destination involves a genuinely different and specific risk assessment process, and that comparing security needs across such wildly different countries in context may not be an entirely fair exercise. Both sides have a point, and that is exactly why this story refuses to resolve cleanly. Subscribe to Royal Daily Report right now, because the specific detail about the courtroom photograph is where this story took its strangest turn, and it is the detail that changed how a significant number of observers read the entire 40-page document. Subscribe now. Hit that button. Turn on those notifications. Subscribe now. Critics say the first genuinely major credibility questions about the report emerged specifically when people started looking considerably more closely at its detailed contents, rather than simply accepting the headline summary. One section reportedly referred to a woman who had allegedly gained access to a London courtroom on 2 separate occasions. At first glance, a lot of readers understandably interpreted that as a genuinely serious security concern, assuming it pointed towards someone dangerous. Then, online discussion identified the woman in question as someone widely known and described as a devoted, entirely public Sussex supporter. The kind of enthusiastic fan who shows up to court hearings because she is a genuine admirer, not someone with any documented connection to threats or violence of any kind. Critics argued this specific and quite embarrassing detail fundamentally changed how they read the entirety of the rest of the document from that point forward. If a well-known, entirely benign supporter had been included as part of the overall threat picture, it raised a reasonable question about what else in the 40 pages might deserve the same closer scrutiny. Critics also separately point to what they see as a directly related inconsistency involving Wimbledon. Images from the tournament showed Catherine, the Princess of Wales and future Queen, sitting among the crowd with people visible close by, without obviously visible security measures. One widely shared comment put it simply: "You would have a hard job spotting any security around Catherine at times." Critics point to that image alongside her broader pattern of continued public appearances following her own cancer treatment as evidence that the general public risk environment across the UK may not match the picture painted in the specific privately commissioned report. Others push back that security decisions are based on individual specific threat assessments rather than any general national risk level, and that visible security is never the full picture, regardless of who is being protected. There is another thread running through a lot of this public discussion right now. Who else might genuinely be shaping Harry's decisions from behind the scenes? Some commentary has turned specifically to Meghan on this question. One royal analyst put forward a theory that circulated widely, that she does not actually want to come to the UK, that she is genuinely afraid of a poor public reception, and that she has allowed Harry to believe the security situation is more dangerous than it is specifically so, that his request for protection fails, giving them both a ready-made excuse not to travel. I want to be clear that this is an opinion, not an established fact, and plenty of people disagree with it entirely. But it is the kind of theory that keeps surfacing precisely because critics believe they can see a pattern. When restraint would serve the moment, the public response tends toward confrontation instead. And when the couple is expected to simply move forward quietly, something new tends to surface that reopens the entire dispute. Subscribe to Royal Daily Report right now, because what happened in an entirely different context about 2 weeks ago, and why a lot of people immediately read it as a direct and quite pointed contrast to everything we have just discussed, is the part of this story that tells you where the broader narrative is actually heading. Subscribe now, hit that button, turn on those notifications, subscribe now. William appeared on the Kelsey Brothers podcast without the kind of intense advance build-up a royal media appearance typically generates. He simply sat down, answered questions, and had what came across as a genuinely relaxed conversation. Supporters watching the episode saw it as authentic and genuinely easy to connect with, the kind of natural charisma that cannot really be manufactured or rehearsed in advance. Travis Kelce's introduction of William was notably warm and detailed, going well beyond standard professional courtesy, and a lot of viewers specifically commented afterward on that warmth as a genuine and unscripted sign of regard rather than anything performed for the cameras. Around roughly the same period, actor Eugene Levy was separately asked, in an entirely different interview context, whether he had discussed Harry and Meghan at all during his own personal conversation with William. His answer was simple: "I did not ask about it. It was not of interest. I had better things to talk to him about." Supporters of William pointed to that fairly dismissive response as strong evidence that conversations happening around him in his day-to-day professional life genuinely tend to focus on his substantive work rather than gravitating automatically toward royal family drama. Critics of Harry drew the comparison directly. While Harry has spent years publicly discussing his grievances across interviews, documentaries, and a memoir, William has spent that same period building long-term initiatives and showing up consistently for the institutional work itself. Catherine completed the Three Peaks Challenge roughly 18 months after finishing her own cancer treatment, raising money specifically for the hospital that had provided her care. She did the entire thing with relatively little advanced fanfare or media buildup, deliberately keeping public attention focused on the underlying cause and the fundraising itself, rather than on her own personal achievement. The contrast with what was coming out of California at the same time, documentary announcements, media appearances, brand launches, the constant churn of public content, was, according to observers paying close attention, impossible to ignore. Here is what a lot of people say gets lost entirely when the surrounding coverage stays fixed purely on the emotional drama of this ongoing story. Multiple genuinely separate institutions have reportedly reached broadly similar conclusions about this exact situation, apparently independently of each other, without any obvious coordination behind the scenes. Critics point not just to the UK government's own formal decision on this matter, but also to the palace's separate public position, to the Oversight Committee's notable lack of any formal escalation process being triggered, and to the genuinely conspicuous absence of any visible public support from senior working royals throughout this entire extended dispute. The palace has publicly stated that security decisions are a matter for the Home Office, specifically reinforcing that the royal family itself is not the body making these determinations. William and Catherine have not made any public statements on this specific dispute, either way, choosing instead to remain entirely silent throughout its various developments. When multiple genuinely separate institutions, each operating independently, without any obvious coordination between them, arrive at broadly similar conclusions about the same underlying question, critics argue that specific pattern deserves genuine and sustained attention rather than simply being dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. Critics also argue, taking a considerably broader view of this entire situation, that the security dispute was never really only about security in the narrow literal sense. They believe it came to represent a much larger and more fundamental question about status recognition and what continued privileges someone can reasonably expect after formally stepping back from an institution. In this particular reading, leaving the royal family formally and publicly meant leaving behind not just the titles themselves, but the entire underlying structure of official state-backed support that came directly attached to those titles in the first place, and the ongoing request for a security level typically reserved for working royals became, in this view, part of a broader and still unresolved disagreement about identity and continued institutional responsibility. Others disagree entirely with this broader institutional reading and maintain firmly instead that Harry's underlying safety concerns have been genuine, consistent, and sincerely held throughout this entire multi-year saga, entirely regardless of how the government or the palace has ultimately chosen to respond. And that is where this story sits right now, unresolved, contested, generating more questions than answers, with a 40-page privately commissioned report on one side and a liaison officer phone number on the other, with travel to conflict zones on one side and claims of danger in London on the other, with 43 paying spectators surrounded by 100 manufactured ones, and a veteran somewhere who signed up to compete because one man made a promise, and who is watching all of this and wondering whether the man who is fighting about motorcades and security reports is the same man who made it. That is all for tonight, friends. I am James, and this has been Royal Daily Report. If this story hit different for you tonight, hit that like button right now. Subscribe if you have not already, and turn on those notifications, because we are here every single week with the complete picture that other channels skip past. Share this tonight with someone who has been following this story and who deserves the full analysis, not just the headline version. Subscribe now, Tell 5 friends. I will see you in the next one. Until then, stay informed, stay curious, and stay royal. Goodbye, friends.